is happening. Okay. Good evening to everyone. It is a great pleasure to begin a new Masechet of Mishnah, a new section of Mishnah. And this week we are beginning from the very beginning of Avodah Zarah. Avodah Zarah literally means strange or foreign worship or alien worship. That doesn't mean we're worshiping aliens. Avodah Zarah is a term that's used to describe idol worship, idolatry. And so this is the section of the Mishnah that deals with how we deal with, and also more to the more common point, how we deal with idolaters. As you're going to see going through, it's clear that the rabbis lived in a very different world. They lived in a world of idolatry in a way that we have maybe difficulty conceptualizing in the modern world. And part of that is because Torah, through its reverberating impact on society, has removed idolatry in most forms, in most blatant forms, from much of the world. And so we may not recognize idolatry in its original incarnation and the way that the rabbis experienced it. So when we read through this, we have to be very careful that when we talk about Ovdei Kochavim, those who worship the stars, one of the euphemisms used for idol worshippers, that idolators, right? That the word idolater, hold on, we'll do it like that. The word idolater is not the same as the word non-Jew. That Judaism, even in the days of the rabbis, and even more so in our own day, recognizes that idolater and somebody can be non-Jewish without being an idolater. That an idolater is somebody who, that they are deliberately engaged in a worship of multiple gods, of natural phenomenons as expressions of those gods, or of statues or structures that are said to house or embody those gods. But there are lots of non-Jews in the world.
Before Christianity.
Before Christianity, before Islam, before anything else, there were lots of non-Jews who weren't. Now, in their days, this population, we can actually do a sort of a graph here, right? It was kind of like this. Say that in the days of the rabbis, something like 95% of the world was idolaters. There were Jews, and many Jews, unfortunately, were also idolaters, but there were Jews who at least were not supposed to be idolaters, and there were a few non-Jews that also were not idolaters, but there were no, in the areas where our people lived, there were no main communities during the time of the Mishnah that were distinctively and committedly non-idolatrous. The beginnings of Christianity is more complicated because it was not a unified community at that point. There were many different styles of early Christianity, and so some of them were close to idolaters, some of them were very far from idolatry, like the early Gnostic Christians, but in the US category. And our biggest problems with Christianity in that early time had less to do with idolatry and more to do with the concept left over from the board. The bigger issues that had to do with early Christianity in those days had to do with the concept of the Trinity and the physicality of God and a personhood and all of that. So,
what comes over with the Buddhism and Confucianism?
With what?
With the Buddhism and Confucianism.
So Confucianism is not a religion at all. It's a pure street philosophy of social structure and also political philosophy. Many Confucians, however, were idolaters who worshipped their ancestors or worshipped other gods in the Chinese pantheon. Many Confucians were not. They were more completely secular. And Buddhism as well, the straight teachings of Buddha as in and of themselves, although there are many things in them of their cosmology, of its view of the universe that Judaism disagrees with, the straight teachings of Buddhism are not inherently idolatrous. However, the common folk practice for many, many hundreds and thousands of years in many parts of the world did have idolatrous elements in it. So even though Buddha himself would not have been considered a proponent of idolatry, many people who followed what they called Buddhism afterwards added idolatrous elements to it. So it gets very, very complicated. But in the days of the Mishnah, there were no Confucians and Buddhists rubbing elbows with the rabbis.
But they were Jews in India.
Not during the days of Mishnah. Well, not during the days that the Mishnah was being discussed. I mean, there were Jews who lived there as very, very remote, but they were not adding and contributing to the Mishnah itself. So those experiences are not encountered in the Mishnah when we talk about idolatry. But to get back to my little graph here, elegant as it is, this is way back in the beginning of Judaism, and nowadays it's probably closer to 90 or so % of the world is non-Jewish and non-idolatrous. There has been a huge shift of humanity away from idolatry over the last 2,000 years. So as we read the edicts and the decisions and the interactions with idolaters in the days of the Mishnah, we have to bear that in mind, that the experiences that they had was of a heavily idolatrous world, of blatant idolatrous, where people are worshiping statues and offering up to them and committing various acts in their statues' names, and worshiping trees and bushes and mountains and the sun and the moon and the stars. That was what our ancestors witnessed constantly from the cosmopolitan world around them. What they also witnessed were that those idolatrous nations usually had cultures with major elements in it that we took exception to. So you can think, for example, when the rabbis who were mostly during the Mishnah time under Roman rule were experiencing what Roman culture had to offer, they said, so your idols, those are the ones that tell you that you should have Colosseum blood sports? That's what idolatry does? Your idols and this idolatry stuff, that's what tells you that having these orgies is an okay thing? We looked at their culture as a reflection of their faith, or their faith as a reflection of their culture, and said that's really not for us. Because even though there may be Jews who engage in murder or other issues, Judaism itself is very clearly opposed to those issues. And so our view of idolatry was often compounded by our rather negative experiences with the idolaters. Make sense? Because we're going to find a lot of things in here that are really negative, not only about idolatry, but about idolaters and our interaction with them, and why we are keeping them at arm's length in so many different cases. And it's really important to understand that idolater doesn't mean non-Jew, right? So we don't apply the rules in here to just a random non-Jew that you happen to meet. And also that the idolatry that they experienced and the communities of idolatry that they interacted with were so corrosive and so painfully immoral that there's a good reason why you would want to keep them at arm's length.
So basically, the idolater is anyone that worships something other than God.
The problem is with both the phrase God and worship, right? So someone can worship God, that is to say Adonai, but with an idol, which is what the crime of the golden calf was, and still be an idol worshiper and still be an idolater. On the other hand, someone can worship something that isn't God without an idol, and they won't technically be an idolater, but they will still be, in our opinion, missing the mark. So it's more complicated. And also, just what does it mean to actually worship? And that goes into great detail of what does it mean to worship an idol? Is walking in front of an idol enough? Is it bringing an offering is enough? Where do you draw the line of what counts as I have worshipped this idol in order to be classified as an idol worshiper?
Yeah, because I was thinking about worshiping the sun.
Mm-hmm.
Are they idolaters because the sun they didn't have the sun in their hands?
Yes.
And if they didn't create any figure, anything about the sun, was an abstract idea. So are they?
Well, it's not an abstract idea, it's a physical object. And the people who worship natural objects as gods, rather than celebrating the natural wonders as a reflection of God's glory, we absolutely categorize that as idolatry. So for people who worshipped Helios, for example, the Greek sun god, that was absolutely considered to be idolatry. Something to bear in mind when you go out to see the eclipse on Monday. Okay, so shall we get some Mishnah down on the table so we have something to talk about with more meat on the bones? Okay, so we are on page 2, which is Avodah Zarah 1:1. You can't get more beginning than that. And I need a volunteer.
I'll read.
Oh, good. Only one person. Thank you.
On the 3 days preceding the festivals of idolaters, it is forbidden to conduct business with them, to lend articles to them or borrow from them, to lend or borrow any money from them, to repay a debt, or to receive repayment from them.
Okay. No? What? What are we talking about here? On the 3 days before a festival idolater, right? So imagine there's, idol worshiping festival number 252, and it is on August 15th, right? There isn't such as far as I know, but imagine there is some great festival for Zeus on August 15th. For the 3 days before that, so August 14th, August 13th, August 12th, you are not allowed to do any of these activities with an idolater, right? So you can't go and buy a camel from them, and you can't sell a camel to them. You can't lend them your shovel, and you can't borrow a shovel. You can't lend or borrow money with them, and you can't repay a debt or receive a repayment for a debt they have with you for those 3 days. They are blackout days for these types of interactions. So first of all, what is the corollary? What's the converse? What happens for the non-3 days before? What?
You can't do anything.
You can, right? So 3 days, so 4 days before their festival, if you want to borrow their shovel or if you want to lend your axe, you can, right? That was permitted. But for the 3 days before, and doing business and doing these loans and other things, so for the other days of the calendar year, if it wasn't right in that window, you were allowed to have that interaction. For those 3 days, they're blackout days.
Why did they select the 3 days? I'm curious about why 3 instead of 4 instead of 5.
I saw the really no explanation.
Okay.
What the rabbi explains because they gonna think if you give it if you sell them something,
Mm-hmm.
they gonna think, oh, thanks my idol,
Mm-hmm.
I'll receive this money from or whatever you give it, if you're selling or
Right.
you buy something from them.
Right. So the general worry is that if you do anything positive, like one of these acts during this time period, that they will have more reason to rejoice with their idol, or they will they will claim that the good thing that just happened is because of their God, their idol, and therefore say, woohoo, look at my God helping me go, right? My God gave me the repayment that you did. And we don't want to give them extra reason for celebration. We don't want to be joining in for their party with their God. But to come back to your question of why not 5 days? Why not 2 days? So the general understanding is that for 3 days is used in the Torah as our preparation for receiving the Torah itself at Mount Sinai, and in general seems to be a reasonable amount of time, half a week prior to an event, that you might be engaged in those kinds of preparation. And indeed, that idea comes up in other places in Talmud as well, where a 3-day preparation period is a reasonable prologue to a particular activity. And indeed, it's definitely a feeling that one should spend, the 3 days leading up to Shabbat, making sure that everything is ready for that coming Shabbat. Right? You don't start Friday afternoon. So there's an obvious question that Rabbi Yehuda is going to raise, which is talking about why shouldn't I receive the repayment from them? Right? I mean, If he owes me $5,000 and I can go on his door the day before the festival and demand that he give me back the $5,000, then I'm getting it, right? He's not going to be happy about that. He just had to pay me back. And Rabbi Yehuda explains.
Rabbi Judah says we should receive repayment from them, as this can only depress them.
Right? They'll be unhappy if they have to pay me back. But
the rabbi said to him, even though it is depressing at the time, they are glad of it subsequently.
Right? Which is a wonderful bit of human psychology. That it's just, I'm always amazed at how the rabbis are able to understand human nature so well. Because everybody knows if you've got a credit card debt, you hate paying the credit card debt off. The only thing worse than paying it off, though, is not paying it off and knowing that it's still hanging over you. So yeah, I'm going to be unhappy having to give you back your $5,000. But once I've given it back, at least it's gone, right? I feel better and relief that the debt has been cleared. So paying back a debt can still be a sense of celebration, even if in general we don't like giving up money. And I just love that the rabbis were so astute to recognize that paying off a debt can still be a cause to make someone happy. And we don't want to make anybody happy right before they go to worship their idol, because it's bad enough that they're doing that. We don't want to add to that celebration. Needless to say, you wouldn't be sending them greeting cards, happy Bacchanal Day. I hear that you're throwing your child into the furnace of Molech. Congratulations. That obviously we wouldn't be doing any deliberate well-wishing either. But these things that you might have thought would be innocent are still adding to their general, good disposition, which we don't really want to increase.
Today's date, that's still, we cannot, like when Christmas comes.
So you're getting there early.
Okay.
But the question of how and who do we count as idolaters in the modern world is a very, very good one, and one that has a lot of controversy. So, for example, in most opinions, for most of the sages that have written about it over the last 1,500 years, most Jewish sages say that Islam is not idolatry, right? Because they are very clear they don't have an image of their God, they don't worship an image of a God, they don't even make pictures in their mosques or other places of worship. And it's very clear in the Quran as well that they do not want idolatry. Whether or not individual members do or don't is less important than the actual belief of the religion. Because we all know that there are individual Jews who worship idols, but that doesn't mean Judaism is idolatry. So in the hierarchy of other religions, Islam is the clearest non-idolatrous religion of the other major religions. Christianity is more complicated because you are faced with the fact that many Christians seem to use the symbol of the crucifix, the symbol of Jesus on the cross, like an idol, or seem to use a symbol of Mary like an idol, or seem to use saints, statues of saints like an idol.
Or the rest of the body and the blood.
That is less a question of idolatry and more a question of the idea of God having a body in the first place. Because it isn't that we would be making an offering to the wafer. Right? We're going to see idolatry in the worship of idols really in the rabbi's mind doesn't mean physical. It means what you do to the physical thing. Are you putting a piece of food in front of it and saying this is for the idol? Are you bowing down in front of it and saying this is for the idol? And people don't bow down for communion as the object itself. They're not bowing to the object. They are preparing themselves for what they're doing. The same way that when we bow down in Aleinu, we're not bowing down to an object, even though we happen to be pointed towards the Aron HaKodesh, even though we happen to be pointed towards the Torah. Or in Jerusalem, we happen to be pointed towards Jerusalem, or if you're at the Kotel, you're pointed towards the stones. It might be interpreted as bowing to the object, but we know that that's not what we're doing. At least we're supposed to know that that's not what we're doing. And so Christianity becomes more complicated with that. Hopefully you can see the parallels, that in strict Christian theology, one is not supposed to be bowing to the statue of Jesus, right? One is not supposed to be making an offering to the statue of Mary. One is supposed to be simply remembering and being inspired by that location in order to direct themselves towards the actual object of their worship. Now, the worship of Mary gets even more complicated, and that there's a big schism within many different parts of Christianity of exactly how she fits into everything. Just like with the Trinity, it becomes very problematic. So you have a range of opinions in the Jewish world. There are rabbis that go from the early days and through the Middle Ages that say Christianity is in error in how it understands God, with the whole idea of the Trinity and the idea of a physical embodiment of God living and dying on earth. But the actual Christian worship service is not idolatrous, that they are not worshiping a statue of God, they are worshiping God, and there happens to be a mistaken understanding of what God is. But you have other Jewish scholars who say, no, even though that may be strict Christian belief, that when you read their actual theology, they know that their God is not really the crucifix. Nevertheless, the average Christian really does act and behave towards a crucifix as though it were an idol. And that is enough to put it into the category of idolatry as a religion. Personally, I find that less convincing. I believe that a religion should be judged based on its tenets and beliefs, not just on the practices of its people. Because there have been many times throughout our history, most notably almost every chapter of the Book of Kings, when we were not obeying Judaism the way we were supposed to obey Judaism. And if somebody was to come and say, is Judaism idolatrous, by examining the behavior of Ahav and Jezebel, the answer would have been, yeah, we're idolatrous. I mean, look at, they're worshiping Baal left, right, and center and killing the prophets of God. But that's not Judaism. That was Jews. Well, not Jezebel, she was a foreigner, but that was the behavior of some Jews, even many Jews, especially in the northern kingdom. Judaism, on the other hand, is absolutely 100% opposed to idolatry in every way, shape, and form. So even though I believe that Christianity is not as clear about what it means by God as I would like them to be, as to keep it from being non-material and non-physical, their actual theology, in their own mind, they are clearly saying one shouldn't worship idols. They may poorly reconcile that, in my opinion, by how they decorate their facilities and do their services. But I have to at least take their theology as its word, which is to say they do not believe they are engaging in idolatry. They would not call what they do idolatry. They would not call a crucifix an idol. And that is enough to say they are not idolaters. They may not be 100% in line with what I believe about God and what I think should be believed about God, but they are not in the either. But there's a huge range of argument about this in Judaism because it's a very complicated topic.
I've heard quite often, the desire to strike a balance between how we treat the Torah scroll and keep
the veneration and yes.
So there's respect, obviously, and we stand and we follow it around the room. We don't put our back to it. We kiss and all that. But then
we bury it when it's.
This is the first year in my life that I heard that when we turn and say Gadlu, it's in respect to the Torahs that are in the Ark. I never heard that before.
So it's in respect to the Torahs that we have not chosen to read from. It's almost as saying that we didn't. It's not the respect to the physical object itself, but to their content, in the sense that we didn't. My double negatives right. We're reading from the Torah in our hands, but we could have read from the others as well. And we don't want to make it look like we chose this Torah because the others were wrong. because there was a mistake in the others. The others are fine, and the others are fully worthy of our respect in the sense that they have the right content and they are real Torahs. They really do contain the words that God wants us to have. But today we're reading from this one. And so in order to assuage any suspicion that perhaps the other Torahs are somehow in error or inferior by content, we show that we give them respect as well. And it wasn't because of their deficiency that we chose this Torah to be the one for our reading. What's that? Well, again, so for many people, showing respect to the fact that there is no deficiency in them can become, I respect the physical structure of the Torah itself. And having respect for the physical Torah of the physical structure of the Torah itself can be another step towards worshiping the Torah itself. And indeed, that is only assuaged if we actually care more for the content than the physical embodiment of the Torah itself. And how do we do that? We show the content as much and more respect than we do the procession of the Torah around the room. That is to say, if you are willing to stand up for the Torah going around the room, you should stand up for the words of the Torah in your life. If you are willing to reach out and kiss the words of Torah, you should be willing to reach out and do the words of Torah in your life. If you are willing to be quiet or sing joyously as the Torah marches around, then when the Torah is being read, you should be listening attentively to be able to understand its words. Unfortunately, many people miss those points, and they treat the physical Torah with more respect than they treat the content of the Torah. My teacher, Rabbi Artson, in the rabbinic school, the dean of the school, would say, nothing is more spiritual for many Jews than taking the Torah out of the ark, and nothing is a bigger turnoff for many Jews than reading from the Torah itself. And that's a real problem within our own community. But that doesn't mean Judaism says that's how we should treat the Torah. Judaism has created a set of practices that is meant to guide us towards point A, but if people happen to take those practices and end up at point B, we can't blame the faith as being intending what people have gone to do, which is problematic and hard, and something that we continually wrestle with, of how do we get people to show the respect and to have that connection without having them overshoot and end up in worshiping the physical object itself.
And I'm still baffled in my own life when I learned things late in life. You know, I was in my 20s before I knew it was a two-Bishvat Seder. And, you know, I went to Hebrew school.
That's relatively recent, so that's okay.
But here I am at my age,
right.
And this is the first time I hear that something that I've done for the majority of my life without understanding why.
And that is one of the biggest difficulties that we face.
So
how do we get that information?
It was just a chance.
Yes.
That I was in the room at the time that you explained it in the chapel.
Exactly.
And you said, we don't turn around because there are no Torahs there. I went,
right.
What?
When we take all the Torahs out of the ark,
what?
There's nothing to turn around and say God lu to. Right. So, for example, if you only have 2 Torahs in the ark, like we do in the chapel, and we take them out for the main Torah and the Maftir Torah, when we say God lu, we don't face the Torah. We don't face the ark, because what are we bowing towards? The box. Right? The box is only sacred because the Torahs that are in it, and the Torahs are all out of it, and therefore.
So how do we get the message out? So that when we do the things that we do because we do it. I was brought up in a time when if you ask questions, it was just because.
Right.
The answer.
So that's the first thing we have to change, right? And then that's the
always done.
Well, and saying we've always done it this way, although usually not correct, is not a bad answer of why we do it in terms of why we do it, but what is it meant to mean? What is the intention? What is the spirituality behind it? What is my soul supposed to gain by engaging in this practice? That is never answered just by we've always done it, or let alone the word because. So that is one of the big problems. But the becauses, or that's the way we've always done it, this is maybe a little bit far off field, there was a major disruption in the chain of Jewish explanation of generation to generation during the late 1800s and through the middle of the 20th century. As more and more Jewish communities were disrupted by anti-Semitism and outright destruction, as more and more Jews moved to new communities, often leaving behind older generations, we lost some of that information that had been passed piecemeal, little bit by little bit, so that it was saturating the community. And it became information that was found only in books, or information that was only found in certain scholars. And we are now in the business of reseeding that information so that it becomes common understanding and common knowledge. But during the middle time, my youth as well growing up, because was a useful way for people who didn't know and were uncomfortable that they didn't know to act like they knew. But they knew that they didn't know, and that kind of bothered them. And many of them, it bothered them because they knew that they had made choices in their life that had perhaps kept them from knowing. You know, they had to work on Shabbat because when they first were an immigrant, it was necessary to support their family, but that meant they had less time to learn the rituals and the meanings behind the rituals. But they were proud that they at least knew the ritual. And that meant that they would hold on to what they still knew. And so they held on to doing, even if they didn't have the understanding. But Judaism says doing without understanding is good. It's better than not. But it's supposed to be followed up with understanding. And that's what we're now trying to recover in the 21st century.
Could you agree that the idea behind the Gadlu could be a different interpretation? In other words, to me it says, let's rejoice together.
Mm-hmm.
Rejoice with me. And the leaders are what they're doing is, and anyone on the Bima is becoming part of the congregation by turning around and joining the congregation. And they're not bowing to us. We're all bowing as one. It's easier for them to turn around than for the whole congregation.
To all be pointed the same direction, right?
Again, you know, the beauty of our religion is that, you know, you have an answer for this. If
right.
I go somewhere else, I might get another answer.
God willing, you will. Right. So that gets us much further afield of what customs, as opposed to halakha, is able to be either reinterpreted or readapted. There's what we call a nafkamina. There's a real practical implication, which would be, with that interpretation, when the Torah scrolls are out of the ark, you would still turn and bow. Whereas in the interpretation that I gave, with the Torah scrolls out of the ark, you would not. The other question becomes, why are we bowing to this direction if there's nothing there? Or if we're not intending it towards some symbol that's in front of us? Why not bow to the left or bow to the right or bow where we're standing and we can all be bowing together? Why do we have to be pointed the same way? Which would especially have been more of an issue in the older synagogue style, where people sat in a U shape rather than all facing. But that's it's an interesting question that we should follow up maybe more together rather than right now. Okay, Mishnah 1-2.
Ishmael says, on the 3 preceding days and the 3 following days it is forbidden. But the sages say, before their festivities it is forbidden, but after their festivities it is permitted.
All right, so Rabbi Ishmael is adding an additional stringency. He's saying not only before, but also after all the things that we mentioned in the previous Mishnah, you shouldn't do when it's around one of their festivals. But the sages say, no, you don't have to go that far. We just don't want to build up their rejoicement. We don't rejoicement. They're rejoicing? They're rejoicing? Rejoicement's not a word, is it? We don't have to build up their their happiness, their celebration. Thank you. We don't want to build up their celebration, but we don't need to be worried about them interacting with us in a joyous mood after the celebration, because we're not adding to that celebration, because that celebration is done. That celebration is done. We're just in the afterglow.
Yeah, but Rabbi Shmuel has a good point.
Of course, that's why he's a rabbi.
The logic of the previous Mishnah, because they can say this following. oh, you see, because I passed celebration, this God helped me to receive money from you.
Mhm.
So it's still the same logic. So I don't know.
But
why
remember, the
they
main
went against.
right. So the main logic wasn't that they would ascribe the good fortune to their god. That's a sort of secondary issue. The main logic is if we do something that makes them, that gladdens them, then that's going to make them happier during their celebration. And we don't want to make them happier for their celebration. If we know that they are about to worship Zeus, we don't want them going to that temple feeling extra happy because of us.
But you strain their beliefs that they are correct. Look how I correct believing that God, because help me now after that, after celebration.
Okay, so
He could be borrowing a shovel too.
right, but even borrowing the shovel, look at like my God helped me get a shovel from this guy, right? It's I got such a good deal on this donkey, but that comes back to one of the challenges the rabbis faced, and which we can read between the lines they had to try and find a balance to, which is they lived with idolaters. They did not say go and hide yourself in an enclave and never interact with anybody who isn't Jewish. They instead said, we know there are idolaters out there, and we're going to go into great detail of what they worship and how they do it. And around that time, we do not want to add to their celebration, but we still need to live with them, and we still need to do business with them, and we still need to interact with them. And how do I know, to use your logic, that on 10 days after the festival, the idolater hadn't made an offering to the idol on his own? It wasn't a festival offering, but it was his own private prayer.
Because
And
we use the measure of 3 days. 3 days before we are corrected.
Right.
3 days before, 3 days after that.
But where do we see 3 days after anywhere else?
Sorry?
Where do we see 3 days after anywhere else?
It's the same as her question at the beginning. What about 5 days before?
But we see an example of three. But we see an example of 3 days before in the giving of Torah itself, of preparing oneself for Matan Torah. So we have an example of 3 days before a major event, but we don't have an example of 3 days after a major event. So there is a parallel for the before, but there isn't really a parallel for the after.
I think I'd still be safe like Ishmael, Rabbi Ishmael.
Well, but so there's safe and then there's over safe,
Overdoing it.
right? Because if you want, it's one of the famous Mishnah dictums, in came ein ladavar sof, right? If you want to be safe, then you're going to go have to lock yourself in a building and never answer the door because it might be an idolater.
But it would be the fence. The Mishnah always teach us to be the fence. So that's a nice fence to build.
But why not build the fence at 5 days, 10 days, 50 days? So once you start building the fence, you have to have an agreement of exactly where the fence is, or else it just becomes stringency, 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 and there is no end. Right? There is, that's what the phrase literally means. Ein ladavar sof. There is no end to the matter. That if you do this, then it's ad infinitum. It will go on forever. And if the rabbis had wanted to say, you are never under any accounts allowed to do business or interact with an idolater at all, because you might make them happy or you might be enticed towards idolatry, they would have said that. But instead they said, no, we live in a world that is saturated with idol worshippers, and we have to deal with it. And by dealing with it, we're going to put some limits in place of how we interact with them and when we do certain things with them, but we are not going to say everything out. So when the majority of Chachamim, of the sages, say 3 days before is quite sufficient to limit these activities, that's the fence that the community then adopts. And if you allow people to feel that they are superior by adding additional planks to their fence, then eventually the community is shamed into becoming more stringent than the sages were anticipating or desiring. That we then become locked away from the rest of the world. And the sages always knew they had to balance our need to be in the world, because we can't do the mission of Judaism if we're not touching the rest of the world, with the need to protect ourselves. Hold on.
Very briefly. So was there a fear that wasn't only adding to their enthusiasm for the upcoming festival, but that the influence of the festival might rub off on the Jewish person who's having the
With
interaction?
this particular issue, that's a really good question. I know definitely in other activities, the rabbis were very concerned that the dust of idolatry would cling to us when we interacted, and that would entice us towards idolatry. And I don't remember reading anything specifically on the business dealings question, but that's definitely an issue that comes up later.
Afterwards, it's over with.
I'm not going to go to your party 3 days after the party, but if I meet with you 3 days before the party, and while we're doing the donkey sale, you tell me how great it's going to be and you invite me, it's definitely a possibility, but I don't remember it reading as a definite connection. Did you have? No.
Just for the joy of teaching, of learning Torah.
Right,
okay? In this question,
Lishma.
okay? Yes.
L'shem Shamayim.
Pure academical, okay,
Yes.
question, okay. What could be an example, like the logical example, that allow you to mark a certain amount of that days after the festival? That, for example, if something happened and like, for example, I don't know, let's say that after the Jewish people received the Torah, so
Right.
a few days after that, they did something wrong. That could be an example of.
Well, they
of
did. I mean,
days.
the golden calf, but
That's what, no, I'm
Yeah.
thinking all the time about an example, like,
Right.
because there were many examples that after and something good, something happened, something wrong, especially during the desert,
yes,
during the 40 years,
Right.
or for
in
example,
the wilderness, yeah.
yeah, when they left Egypt, okay, and they were almost, they left Egypt, we celebrated the Passover, and they started to doubt when they arrived to the Yam Suf.
Right.
That was, so if we know
And
how
3
many
days after
days-
the parting of the sea, we were complaining about the lack of water.
Exactly.
Yes.
That's what I mean. So we have a few examples of days after something positive,
Hmm.
we become to doubt, okay, about our beliefs. So we can use also helping to strengthen the position of Ishmael, taking those parts of the Torah.
It's definitely possible, and if the Tanaim, if the rabbis of the Mishnah were still here for us to debate with, it would be very interesting to hear their response. But the Mishnah has said that Rabbi Ishmael is a lone opinion, and the sages say, nope, we're only worried about the 3 days before.
And we don't have the Gemara, the arguments.
I don't remember reading those arguments. That doesn't mean that they're not there, but I have not, I apologize, memorized the entire Gemara. I know. That's for next year.
Yeah, they've got a lot of confusion there.
No, Rabbi, one more question. What if you don't know that they're doing that celebration? And then you're okay.
Yeah, if you don't know, you don't know. You know, but if all the banners are up, then that's a different issue. So let's talk about their festivals. That's Mishnah 1:3. What are these festivals you speak of?
These are the festivities of the idolaters: Calenda, Saturnalia, Protasis, the anniversary of accession to the throne, and anniversaries of deaths, according to Rabbi Meir.
So Rabbi Meir gives a list.
That's dangerous.
What counts as a festival of an idolater, right? So he gives these three main festivals, Calendin, Saturnalia, and Cartisis, which we do know what they were in the Roman Empire and in the pagan worship around the Mediterranean at the time. As you can see, we actually get in the explanation at the bottom the best guess, right? Calendia was the first day of the month, right? Much similar to our Rosh Chodesh. Saturnalia was the 17th of December, and there's some suspicion that the day of Christmas was chosen to be.
So can you repeat the dates? Calendar was.
Oh, no, he doesn't have the handout, right? So, Calenda, like from the word calendar, was the beginning, the Rosh Chodesh, for there. Right. Saturnalia was the Roman holiday on the 17th of December. That went along with Saturn, their god. right, which was the first day of August, which was when Augustus conquered Alexandria in Egypt. Right, and as it's interesting to point out that we're not 100% sure how all of these names were pronounced in ancient Mishnaic Hebrew. We're going off our best guess of what it would have been. The anniversary of the ascension of the king would have been filled with idolatrous practices because they would have been invoking all of the idols and gods to bless their king, and therefore that is an idolatrous festival. But it's very important politically.
For loyalty, yeah. They can say, hey, you know what, like a man, look at this, or they want to rebel you. They don't want to celebrate your coronation.
Okay. And
that could be very dangerous.
We don't have to go that far back. How long ago was it in America that Jews could not be witnesses in courts or could not hold public office because we would not swear on a Christian Bible? Right? We would not put our hand on a Christian Bible and say, I swear to tell the whole truth, or I swear to uphold the Constitution and all of. There were states that had laws that prohibited people from having public office or from being witnesses if they refused to swear on a Christian Bible. So having an unwillingness to engage in the religious practice of another faith always carries a certain risk. Yes, and this has alienated us from kingdoms, well, all the way back to Pharaoh, we've been uncomfortable with us not being part of their system. So yes, you shouldn't assume that the biggest problem is I can't borrow a shovel for 3 days. The biggest problem is going to be the cultural clash that comes when 95% of the people around you are worshiping rocks and sticks and moon, and you're saying, no, I'm not. That's not the way. That's one of the reasons, by the way, that so many of the midrashim about Abraham, deal with him breaking from idolatry and the price that he paid to do so, and the challenges that he faced to do so, because it's not easy to buck the culture that is surrounding you. So, yes, it is a big issue. However, the sages have a little twist. So let's do part 2 there.
Part 2. But the sages say, a death at which burning of articles of the dead takes place is attended by idolatry. But where there is not such burning, there is no idolatry.
Right. So the Chachamim said to Rabbi Meir, it's not that every death is an idolatrous ceremony, and it's not that every what would have been the equivalent in the idol worshiping world of a yard site, the anniversary of the death. It's not that every celebration of the yard site is idolatrous, but if they are burning the body with its stuff, if they are turning this into an idolatrous type worship, that's when we've got a problem. That's when it's an issue. And apparently that was not universal. They didn't do that with every death, and not every culture did that. So there had to be an act that was of idol worship-ishness in order for it to be considered a prohibited festival for us to then have to avoid the 3-day interaction. So almost certainly the death of somebody important in many idol worshiping countries, we would have had to say, well, if it's 3 days before his funeral, then that's like an idol festival. I can't do anything. But for a regular type person, it probably wouldn't have been a problem.
So it goes back to the fact that we really do have to be part of the world that we live in to understand when these festivals are taking place, what kind of a festival it is, really to be knowledgeable.
Yes.
So that we stay away from it.
Yes.
And so there is a lot of awareness and passive participation.
Or at least passive knowledge, right?
Knowledge of what's going on in the world.
Exactly right. And the same way that throughout the Middle Ages, Jews had to know when Easter was, because that was when it got dangerous. Once the blood libel had begun to be spread, and they were talking about Jews killing Christians for matzah and all of that, right around Easter was when that would peak, those libels, and that was a bad time to be out and about, and certainly not a time to get into trouble. You didn't want to go and say, hey, Duke, I'm here to collect that debt right around Easter time or Passover time. So you had to know something about their calendar in order to stay safe, and that is important. And I think we can definitely finish part 3 here. So we'll keep moving for that.
Part 3. But the day of shaving one's beard and lock of hair, or the day of landing after a sea voyage, or the day of release from prison, or if an idolater holds a banquet for his son. The prohibition only applies to that day and that particular person.
All right, so not 3 days before. And even there, it's only for that person himself. So somebody says, I'm making a banquet in honor of my son, and it's a religious event. For him and his family, I can't go do donkey business. But for the idol guy down the street, who it's not his son, I can still do business with him. And even for the guy who's doing it for his family, it's only on the day of his celebration that I can't do the business with him. Right? But 3 days or 2 days before, I'm fine. So there's a difference between a communal celebration and a private celebration. Right? The private celebration, there's a much smaller concern. Makes some sense? Yes. Maybe? All right. Let's see. You know what? Let's go for it, because I want to get a little more territory. Let's do Mishnah 4.
Mishnah 4. When an idolatrous festival takes place within a city, it is permitted to conduct business with non-Jews outside it. If the idolatrous festival takes place outside it, business is permitted within it.
Okay, so when we say you're not allowed to conduct business with idolaters 3 days or on the day of their festival, how big of a radius does that encompass? Right? If they're having a festival in Alexandria, does that mean I can't do business in Jerusalem? Does it mean I can't do business in the suburbs of Alexandria? And what the Mishnah is trying to say here is, if the festival is in the city, then you can do business outside the city, because the city is considered its own unit. If the festival is in the countryside, like a county fair kind of thing, we're all going to go worship Dionysus together, because he was a sort of outdoor-ish god, then doing business in the city is still considered okay. That if you weren't in the realm of the celebration, even though there might be overlap of people who are going to go to participate from the countryside into the city or from the city into the countryside, what mattered was you were not adding to the festive joy in the area of the festival itself. There was a limit to how far you had to be aware and cautious of interacting during this time.
Of course, if it's national, you don't do it any place.
Yeah, I mean, if the celebration is everywhere, then everywhere is prohibited, yes. And you just better get your groceries early. Part 2.
Part 2. Is it permitted to go there? If the road leads solely to that place, it is forbidden. But if one can go by it to another place, it is permitted.
Right, so let's do a quick little map, just so that so here's the road, and we've got city A and city B, and that's the way the road works. If city A is having an idolatrous festival, then I can't go to city A. I just can't go at all, even if I'm not going to do business. I just have to stay out of city A during their festival. But if city B is going to have a festival, I can go to city B as long as there is another place that road goes. So it's not apparent, it's not obvious, it's not certain that I'm going to that place. Now, does that mean I have to immediately leave city B? No. But it does mean that I have a reason for going to city B that is not going to be, I'm here for the idol festival.
But why? What is the difference? Because you don't want that other people will say, look at this, he tried to enjoy all these people in the celebration, or because you are afraid that they will convince you, or your life will be in danger? What is the reason for that differentiation?
I think we have a suggestion
Yes,
or an additional question.
A real life situation. The rabbi said he would never go into McDonald's even to get a glass of water or get change for the bus, because someone might see him.
Right. So
his congregation, and you come to conclusions. So,
right. So the issue of marit ayin, of the appearance of the thing, is a big issue, right?
It influences other people, especially if it's a leader. Well, they went to that town. I guess I could do that too. What's it for? Maybe And then you start developing new
Right.
notions of things.
So there's the Marid Ayin issue, absolutely, is one of the main reasons, which is people see you going into Idol Central, and there's no other reason why you would be taking that road, then that's going to mislead them, not just about you, but it will mislead them about whether it is permitted for them to do it too. Right? Remember, the issue of Marid Ayin, of the appearance of a matter, wasn't about you doing something wrong. It was about, or people suspecting you're doing something wrong. It wasn't about gossip. It was about misinstructing other people by the example that you set. That by you doing it, you are going to lead other people to do something that actually is wrong, even if you're not doing something wrong. But there is the real danger as well of you go to the dead-end city, that as much as you may try to say to yourself, I'm not going to do the worship, I'm not going to engage in their festival, I'm not going to do it, if there's really no other place that you could be going, there's no other reason for you to be going down that road, you are setting yourself up to be vulnerable to being enticed by the festival that's happening. But if you do have a legitimate alternative, that at least gives you psychologically an out, that you have a reason for going that is other than the worship, and if it gets too intense, you have a legitimate reason that to have been there and you can keep going, rather than saying, well, I'm already here, I might as well worship. Hand me that sheep. There is some help at getting you out of that feeling of I'm definitely worshiping the idol.
But again, the dilemma is if you know it's happening in the city and you have all these regulations about staying away from it,
Right.
Is it really that crucial that you have to go to that city?
Right. In general, not. But the rabbis were, despite what may be apparent from the modern world, but the rabbis were loath to make prohibitions that were more burdensome or more difficult for the average person to follow. So they wanted to find not always what was the best and most laudable and praiseworthy course of action, but what was the actual law? Where was the minimum behavior? And this is where they drew the line, that the minimum behavior was, if there's nowhere else you're going except for the idol party, then don't go. But if you could be going past the idol party of part B, we're not going to tell you to stop. You may, by your own heart, know if I'm in that place and they got their celebration going on, I think I'm going to give in and I'm going to be worshiping an idol by the end of the weekend. Then you probably shouldn't go. But if you believe you can go and not be a problem, the rabbis can't tell you that it's prohibited to go. Might still not be recommended, especially depending upon what they do during their festivals. But they won't prohibit you from going just because there happens to be a celebration in that town. Because there are many times when people needed to go to towns, like to visit the other Jews who were living there, who happened to be stuck in that city. That's just where they lived. And they didn't want to say no unless they were absolutely sure that this was a problem. I know some people like to make edicts all the time now, and it's like, almost like fatwas. But the rabbis were very, very careful to try and find the actual line, what we call the shurat hadin, the line of the law, not just go 3 steps beyond it and pretend that that's the law. All right, last section.
A city in which an idolatrous festival is taking place, some of its shops being decorated and some not decorated. This was the case with Beit Shan, and the sages said, in the decorated stores it is forbidden to buy, but in the undecorated ones it is permitted. Okay, so we'll get to the basic halacha, then a little history. The basic halacha is you're in the street and you've got pagan decoration, no decoration, pagan decoration, and you know there's a festival coming up, and you know the no decoration shop, the shop owner certainly isn't Jewish, but you can still do business with him because it seems that he is not celebrating. Again, this is with the idea that there would be decorations as part of the celebrations and such, but because he's not celebrating, or at least not celebrating as is the custom of that place, therefore you don't have to have the same worry in interacting with him that you would if you went to one of the decorated shops on either side. Historically, the interesting little tidbit here of Beit Sha'an, has anyone been to Beit Sha'an? Yep, in Israel, right? It's one of the most amazing archaeological sites in Israel. Construction of what the Roman era city looked like,
And you can still walk down and see where all the shops would have been. The rabbis of the Mishnah, those shops were not in ruins yet, still standing, still owned by a very cosmopolitan group, and worshiping certain pagan idols, and some of them were worshiping different pagan idols, and you could interact with some and not others depending upon whose holiday was coming up where. What Susan said, you have to be a fairly cosmopolitan person if you want to be a knowledgeable and observant Jew. What's going on around you and what they're doing. And that's even more true now than it was in the ancient world, where many of the faiths and practices and ideas around us are more complicated than worshiping a tree. So it takes a great deal of understanding to know how to interact and relate to people around us. Cut and dry. Okay, so we're going to leave Avodah Zarah there for this week, and you are welcome, if you like, to take these home, but that means you have to promise to bring it back next week, because I don't want to burn through paper more than necessary.